December 1943. The bitter wind knifed through the rail yard outside Lyon, curling smoke from the idling locomotives into ghostly shapes above the rooftops. Steam hissed from iron beasts waiting in the dark, trains that carried the fuel, food, and weapons feeding Hitler's armies across occupied Europe. Down on the gravel, a thin young man in a grimy cap shoveled coal with frozen hands, his breath fogging under the yard lamps. To the German guards watching from the siding, he was just another French laborer, half-starved and harmless. They joked that these local moles couldn't lift a rifle, let alone fight a war. One of the officers laughed as he flicked his cigarette onto the tracks and said, "The Americans send spies? Bah, Hollywood ghosts." The men around him chuckled. The young worker kept his eyes down, but inside his jacket pocket was a lump of coal unlike any other. It weighed a little too much, felt slightly wrong, because it wasn't coal at all. He had been told, in a whisper from a man who called himself Jacques, that this single piece could destroy an entire train. It looked harmless, rough and sooty, but inside its shell was a heartbeat of plastic explosive. Made in London, smuggled through Lisbon, handed off by resistance couriers who never lived to see the result. The worker's name was Marcel, but that was not his real name. His real name was on a list somewhere in a Gestapo file marked traitor. He'd stopped using it when he joined the resistance. Tonight he would give this black rock to a locomotive that served the enemy. He scooped the false coal into his shovel, mixing it with the rest. A German corporal shouted something, waving him forward. Marcel obeyed, his boots crunching the frozen ground. His pulse thudded in his ears louder than the hiss of the engine. He tipped the load into the firebox and turned away before the engineer could glance at him. For a moment, he thought the lump would clatter oddly, give itself away. But the fire swallowed it, sparks flying up like shooting stars, and the furnace door clanged shut. The German cursed and shouted for more coal. Marcel walked away without looking back. Hours later, somewhere down the line, the train would vanish in a flash that turned night to day. But for now, the yard was quiet, only the sound of laughter from the guards, echoing under the steel canopy. They laughed at America's invisible army. They laughed at the men and women who fought not with tanks, but with whispers. They called them amateurs, tricksters, dabblers in make-believe. But the laughter wouldn't last. At that same moment, hundreds of miles away in London, a small team of men sat hunched over blueprints in a smoke-filled basement. On the wall behind them was a hand-painted sign, Office of Strategic Services, Section X. They were America's first organized intelligence officers, and nobody in Berlin took them seriously. German propaganda mocked them as Donovan's Dreamers, after their founder, General William Wild Bill Donovan, a lawyer-turned-spy chief who believed victory could come from brains as much as bullets. The Abwehr, Germany's intelligence agency, dismissed the OSS as amateurs playing detective. They said no amount of clever tricks could stop the Reich's iron supply lines. Yet even in their ridicule lay fear. The Germans didn't understand these men who carried no rifles but could make bridges vanish, who looked like farmers but spoke 5 languages, who arrived in villages with false papers and left behind fire. The OSS had come to Europe not to fight on the front lines, but to set the continent on fire from within. Their orders were simple: cripple the enemy's logistics, confuse their commanders, break their confidence. And the easiest way to do that was to make the trains disappear. The irony was almost poetic. The Reich relied on its railway system like veins feeding a beating heart. Every shell, every tank, every loaf of bread for the front moved by rail. The Germans believed their trains were untouchable. Too many guards, too many checkpoints. And yet, their downfall would come not from bombs dropped from the sky, but from the coal they fed their own furnaces. The plan was born from desperation and genius. Somewhere in a converted London workshop, an engineer stared at a lump of Welsh coal and asked himself, what if it could burn and explode at the same time? Within weeks, the OSS laboratories developed what they called black sabotage. Fake coal made of plastic explosive, coated in real coal dust to hide the deception. Resistance networks would carry them across borders, slipping them into bunkers, coal piles, and locomotives. The Germans would feed their own destruction with every shovelful. But in 1943, no one in Berlin believed the OSS capable of such a thing. Reports of small explosions were written off as accidents, negligence, or bad fuel. Americans can't even hide their spies properly, sneered a Gestapo colonel in Paris, reviewing the interrogation of a captured courier. They think war is a game of tricks. He was half right. It was a game, but one in which the pieces moved silently, invisibly, and fatally. Marcel didn't know any of this when he walked home that night through the blackout streets. All he knew was that his heart hadn't stopped racing since the yard. He passed posters of Hitler promising order and victory. He saw neighbors staring at him through cracked windows, afraid to speak. Resistance was a word that could kill a family. And yet, from Norway to Yugoslavia, men and women like him, farmers, teachers, priests, were risking everything to pass a single piece of coal hand to hand like a sacred relic. Each of them carried the same insult in their memory, the laughter of German officers who believed their empire was unbreakable. Each of them carried the same secret hope, that one small act could make that empire bleed. The sound of those explosions, when they came, would not just destroy steel and stone, it would shatter arrogance. In the months to come, trains would begin to vanish without warning. Ammunition wagons would detonate mid-journey. Commanders would demand explanations. Mechanics would tear apart engines looking for causes. They would find nothing, only ashes. And in every pile of ash, somewhere, the faint smell of burned coal. But that night in Lyon, it was still just laughter echoing under the moonlight. Marcel crossed himself before ducking into a shadowed alley, his fingers black with soot. The wind carried the sound of the train departing. Screeching wheels, churning pistons, a slow metallic heartbeat heading east toward the front. He thought of the voices mocking Hollywood spies. He thought of the man who gave him the lump, whispering, "When they burn their own fuel, they'll burn their own future." Somewhere down that track, far from this cold night, something was waiting to prove him right. The Germans laughed at the OSS, at the idea of invisible saboteurs hiding among peasants and coal miners. They didn't know that the war's deadliest weapons were already in motion, small, silent, and unstoppable. By spring, those same officers who laughed would stare at the smoking remains of their trains and ask the same question over and over. How could this happen? They laughed at America's invisible army. They never saw the bombs hiding in their own coal. By the time they realized, their supply lines were ash. The first prototypes failed almost as soon as they were born. In a hidden laboratory beneath Baker Street, a team of chemists and machinists from the OSS gathered around a workbench piled with soot, wiring, and empty teacups. The goal seemed simple. Make a lump of coal that looked, felt, and burned like the real thing, but exploded with surgical precision when placed in a furnace. Yet simplicity in war is always an illusion. The first batches melted before detonation. The second cracked when cooled. The third burned harmlessly like ordinary fuel. Frustration mixed with exhaustion. One engineer, an American named Joseph Deslig, stared at the smoking remains of his latest attempt and muttered, "We're trying to make the devil's coal, and all we get is dust." But General William Wild Bill Donovan refused to quit. The OSS chief was a man who believed in the impossible. To him, warfare was not only fought on the battlefield but in the minds of men who never saw it coming. "The Germans have their panzers," he told his staff. "We'll have our ghosts." That philosophy drove the OSS to recruit everyone from chemists to stage magicians, from linguists to pickpockets. Their tools weren't rifles or bombs. They were tricks, disguises, illusions, and deception so deep it became reality. The coal bomb was to be their masterpiece. Silent, portable, and poetic. To make it work, they needed more than chemistry, they needed craft. Deslig had an idea. Shape plastic explosive around a small metal core, add a detonator the size of a cigarette stub, then coat it with pulverized coal dust mixed with varnish. The result was uncanny. You could drop it into a bucket of real coal and never tell it apart. The test came in the chill of January 1944, at a Royal Navy depot near Portsmouth. They fed one of the prototypes into a test furnace. For 10 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then a dull, throat-deep thump shook the room. The furnace door bent outward like the lid of a tin can. Everyone froze. Then Deslig grinned. "Gentlemen," he said, "the devil's coal burns beautifully." But invention meant nothing without delivery. Across Europe, the Germans controlled every border, every train yard, every coal bunker. Getting these disguised bombs into enemy hands required a different kind of courage. That was where the OSS turned to the underground networks of the European resistance. Men and women who had been fighting with nothing but sabotage, misinformation, and sheer defiance since 1940. They were teachers, postmen, priests, mothers. They had no uniforms, only nerves of steel and faith that the war could still be turned. One of the couriers was a Belgian woman named Elise van der Velde. Her cover story was flawless. A widow delivering coal to German supply depots. In reality, her wooden cart carried both real fuel and a handful of Deslig's black miracles. She would push the cart for miles through frozen villages, past roadblocks and barking dogs, smiling politely at soldiers who never suspected the widow's tears hid explosives. Every journey was a gamble. Every handshake could be betrayal. In February 1944, Elise reached a depot near Namur. German soldiers were unloading wagons under a pale winter sun. She watched the foreman's boots pacing through the slush. One false move, one suspicious glance, and she'd be dragged away. She knelt by the coal pile, pretending to rest, and quietly slipped 3 fake lumps into the heap. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would shake the cart. A guard shouted at her to hurry. She nodded, smiled, and walked away without looking back. That night, the depot vanished in a bloom of orange fire seen from 10 miles away. The Germans called it an accident. Elise called it a small victory. Still, every success was bought with loss. Dozens of couriers were caught. Some broke under torture. Most did not. A young Frenchman named Henri, one of the first to use the coal bombs, was betrayed by a neighbor. He was executed in the yard of Montluc prison, whispering to his captors that they'd never stop what was already burning. His death haunted the network. For every explosion that lit up the night, a family vanished into the dark. The OSS men in London knew it too. Donovan called them the bravest soldiers without uniforms. The Germans tried to adapt. They ordered inspections of coal shipments, installed guards at fuel depots, even tested coal by breaking it apart. Yet the brilliance of the device lay in its deception. You couldn't test every lump, and even if you did, the coating fooled touch, sight, and even smell. Within weeks, paranoia spread faster than the explosions. The enemy began wasting manpower searching their own supplies. The OSS realized they had stumbled upon something greater than destruction. They had found psychological warfare at its purest. But the struggle wasn't just in Europe. Inside the OSS itself, doubts grew. Some officers questioned whether the effort was worth the human cost. "We're turning civilians into execution targets," one analyst said. Donovan's reply was cold but clear. So did the Reich when it occupied their homes. For him, the line between soldier and spy was gone. The war had erased it. The coal bombs weren't about killing for numbers. They were about proving that no empire, no matter how armored, was safe from imagination. One night, a coded transmission arrived in London. A train near Stuttgart had exploded while carrying ammunition to the front. The Germans blamed sabotage but couldn't explain how. The report ended with a chilling note from an Allied agent. Explosion came from inside the firebox. Engine destroyed. Crew gone. Donovan read it silently, then looked up. "That," he said, "is the sound of their laughter dying." Each success fueled another mission, but the work grew harder. Smuggling routes closed, informants disappeared, and the Gestapo grew crueler. The resistance began using children as messengers, women as saboteurs, priests as couriers. They wove the bombs into baskets of bread, hid them under hay carts, buried them near fuel depots. To the OSS, this was proof that the spirit of occupied Europe was alive. To the Germans, it was proof that their control was slipping. One spring morning, a small train loaded with ammunition left Bordeaux. Among its firemen was a resistance agent disguised as a mechanic. He had smuggled 2 fake coal pieces into his shovel hours earlier. As the train rolled through the countryside, he kept glancing at the glowing furnace door, waiting. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The engine thundered across a bridge, and then, a heartbeat later, it vanished in a ball of light. The explosion blew the locomotive clear off the tracks, sending carriages tumbling into the river below. The bridge collapsed like paper. Witnesses miles away felt the ground shake. The Germans sent investigators. They found nothing but fragments, twisted rails, and scorched coal. That night, Radio London received a single coded phrase, "Coal sings in Bordeaux." The message was logged, decoded, and filed under confirmed. Another success, but one that no one would ever celebrate publicly. OSS agents worked in silence, knowing their greatest victories would remain secret. Still, every victory raised the stakes. The Germans began spreading rumors of demon coal, blaming witches and British trickery. Some engineers refused to work the furnaces. Supply trains began running half-empty out of fear. Coal convoys were delayed, and entire divisions were left waiting for ammunition that never arrived. What started as a single experiment in a basement now rippled across the continent, slowing the Reich's heartbeat day by day. But with each operation came loss. Elise was captured in March 1944. A German patrol stopped her near Charleroi and found the false bottom compartment in her cart. She was tortured for 2 weeks and executed without trial. Her last words, recorded by a guard who later defected, were simple: "You will burn yourselves." The OSS received the report months later. Donovan read it in silence, then folded the paper and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Heroes don't wear medals," he murmured. By April, the campaign had become unstoppable. The Germans knew something was wrong, but not how to stop it. Every depot, every train yard, every locomotive was a potential trap. Coal, the symbol of their industrial might, had turned traitor. And though hundreds died delivering those little black bombs, they had kindled something greater: the coming collapse of a war machine that thought it could never be touched. Still, as the OSS looked toward D-Day, one question haunted every agent in London. If the enemy's heart could be burned from within, what would be left of theirs when it was over? The line between courage and cruelty was thin, and invisible wars always left scars no one could see. By the spring of 1944, the explosions had become impossible to ignore. At first, they were scattered incidents: an ammunition car erupting outside Dijon, a coal depot flattened near Antwerp, a munitions train in Norway vanishing into fire at dawn. The Germans blamed sabotage, mechanical failure, even Allied bombing that never happened. But soon the pattern became undeniable. Trains were exploding from within, not from above. They burned not because someone attacked them, but because they fed themselves to death. And with every blast, the laughter that had once filled German command posts grew quieter. It began as a whisper in the Wehrmacht's daily reports: unexplained engine fire, possible enemy interference, fuel contamination suspected. Then came panic. Supply lines to the Western Front faltered just as the Allies were gathering strength across the Channel. For every 100 trains that left Germany full of fuel and ammunition, 10 never arrived. Some vanished into clouds of black smoke that stained the horizon. Others limped home, half destroyed, the remains of their crews buried in slag and ash. The German High Command demanded answers. They found none. Meanwhile, in London, OSS analysts pinned red flags across a map of Europe. Each flag marked a successful sabotage: Belgium, France, Czechoslovakia, Poland. The board glowed with color. A young officer stared at it and whispered, "It's like watching a fever spread." Donovan smiled grimly. The fever had a name now: Operation Eldest Son. The OSS had refined its methods to an art. New batches of explosive coal were rolling out weekly, each more stable, easier to disguise, and deadlier than the last. Resistance networks grew bolder, using the chaos to strike deeper into occupied territory. The War of Whispers had turned into an epidemic of fear. In the Ruhr Valley, the heart of Germany's industry, Coal inspectors were ordered to test every shipment by hand. It was hopeless. Millions of tons moved daily. The saboteurs needed only one piece in 1,000 to break the rhythm of war. A single coal bomb could derail a convoy, destroy hundreds of shells, and kill the morale of every man who shoveled the next load. Factory workers began refusing to feed the furnaces. "It smells strange," one mechanic said, tossing aside a lump that looked no different from the rest. His foreman shouted that he was paranoid, until the furnace next door blew its door off in a thunderclap of smoke and fire. Fear rippled through the ranks like static. Officers who once mocked the invisible Americans now held their breath each time an engine roared to life. Rumors spread among soldiers that the coal was cursed, that Allied witches had hexed the trains. Superstition replaced discipline. German propaganda tried to spin the sabotage as isolated accidents, but even the newspapers couldn't hide the truth. Photographs of twisted locomotives appeared in underground resistance leaflets across Europe under a single headline: "They burn their own blood." By May, the OSS estimated that over 400 German rail incidents were linked to resistance sabotage, at least a quarter caused by explosive coal. But the true victory wasn't measured in numbers, it was time. Every day a train failed to arrive, every bridge left unrepaired, every convoy delayed meant fewer tanks and bullets reaching Normandy. Donovan called it the invisible artillery and told his men that the real invasion had already begun, not on beaches but in the rail yards of France. One evening in occupied France, a Wehrmacht captain named Otto Reinhardt stood over a pile of blackened debris that had once been a train. The explosion had left a crater 20 feet deep. He could still smell burned oil and flesh. His superior demanded a report. Reinhardt bent down, picked up a charred fragment of coal, and stared at it. It was ordinary, too ordinary. "It's not sabotage," he said slowly. "It's something else. Something inside." The colonel dismissed him with a curse, but Reinhardt couldn't shake the image. He had seen enough battlefields to recognize what fear did to men, and fear was spreading faster than fire. Back in London, Deslig received intercepted German messages describing combustible sabotage materials resembling coal. He laughed softly when he read them aloud to Donovan. "They finally believe in our ghosts," he said. Donovan's reply was colder. "Good. Ghosts don't sleep." The OSS now coordinated with the French Maquis to synchronize attacks with upcoming Allied operations. Each successful sabotage created ripples of confusion that blinded German intelligence to the bigger picture. On June 5th, the night before D-Day, dozens of trains scheduled to carry reinforcements to Normandy were halted by unexplained mechanical failures. In truth, the resistance had planted enough explosive coal to paralyze rail traffic across northern France. When the first Allied paratroopers dropped over Normandy hours later, German logistics were already bleeding. One of the last and most dramatic incidents occurred near Metz, where a long freight train carrying panzer ammunition exploded so violently that the shockwave shattered windows 5 miles away. Witnesses described it as a volcanic roar that turned night into a storm of sparks. The train's engineer had no warning. The coal burned normally for half an hour before the blast ripped the locomotive apart. German investigators sent fragments to Berlin, but the analysis only deepened the mystery. The coal dust tested pure. No chemical traces. No foreign material. Nothing. It was as if the fuel itself had chosen to betray them. For the OSS, the success came with a strange kind of awe. The idea that something so small, something no larger than a man's fist, could cripple an empire's lifelines seemed almost supernatural. In one report, an agent wrote, "The enemy is no longer afraid of our soldiers. He's afraid of his own shadows." That fear changed the rhythm of war. Supply depots slowed to a crawl. Coal convoys now traveled under guard, doubling the manpower needed. The Reich's machine, once efficient and unstoppable, began to sputter like a dying engine. Still, no one in London celebrated openly. The OSS officers worked behind blackout curtains, filing reports that would never make headlines. They knew the real heroes were out there, the couriers who smuggled the bombs, the miners who slipped them into heaps, the nameless saboteurs who vanished into the night after lighting a fuse that needed no match. Many never returned. Their names remained classified for decades, but their work spoke louder than medals. In the weeks following D-Day, the Wehrmacht's transport ministry estimated that nearly 40% of military shipments in France had been delayed or destroyed. Ammunition shortages crippled divisions fighting in Normandy. Reinforcements from the east arrived days late. One German colonel wrote in his diary, "Our trains explode before they reach the front. Our enemy fights from within our fires." Those words, intercepted later by Allied intelligence, became a quiet badge of honor among OSS officers. As summer deepened, the resistance pushed harder. Coal bombs appeared not just in locomotives but in power plants, depots, and factories. The explosions became rhythmic night after night across Belgium, Poland, Hungary. The sky flickered with orange bursts, and each one carried a message. The empire that prided itself on order was now devoured by chaos. By August 1944, as Paris rose in rebellion and the Allies pressed inland, the Germans had lost control of their own supply chain. Freight yards were wastelands of twisted steel. Engineers abandoned locomotives mid-route, terrified of touching their fuel. Coal inspectors were executed for incompetence. Mechanics fled their posts. The once flawless rail empire of Europe had turned into a graveyard of rust and smoke. In a debriefing months later, a German prisoner admitted to his interrogators, "We began to fear the coal more than the bombs from your planes. At least we could see those coming." That confession summed up the triumph of the OSS. Their invisible war had worked because it made the enemy afraid of his own breath, his own routine, his own tools. For the first time in years, the resistance dared to smile. They had turned the Reich's strength, its machinery, its discipline, its dependence on fuel, into a weapon against itself. When the Allies finally marched through liberated towns, they found rail yards still smoldering, trains frozen mid-journey, and piles of coal untouched, as if even the dead were afraid to disturb them. The war in Europe was turning. The Germans who had laughed at Hollywood spies were now prisoners of their own fear. And though most never learned the name of the organization that orchestrated it, the effect was carved into history. Every shattered locomotive, every silent depot, every empty track was a monument to a war fought not with armies, but with imagination. The OSS had done what armies could not. They had made the enemy destroy himself. And as the smoke drifted over Europe that summer, one truth became clear. Victory doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes, it whispers from a handful of coal, waiting to ignite. When the war finally turned, few knew the names of the people who had helped turn it. The soldiers who stormed Normandy would go down in history, their faces printed in newspapers and their courage broadcast to the world. But the quiet men and women who had made the German trains vanish, those whose weapons were lumps of coal and whispered passwords, remained invisible. The OSS didn't send medals to ghosts. Their victories lived in classified reports stamped "Top Secret," and in the empty spaces on German rail maps where once there had been lines of steel. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Donovan walked through his London office in silence. On the walls hung maps filled with tiny black pins marking sabotage sites. He stopped before one that covered France. Half the pins were near rail junctions, each representing a locomotive destroyed, an ammunition car burned, or a bridge collapsed. "They said our ghosts were amateurs," he murmured, tracing the routes with his finger. "Now those amateurs have written history in smoke." His aides didn't speak. They knew too many names on those pins belonged to agents who'd never come home. In Germany, the aftermath was ruin. The once proud Reichsbahn, the lifeline of Hitler's war machine, was a skeleton of twisted tracks and shattered depots. Train yards looked like cemeteries of steel. Engineers picked through the wreckage in disbelief. "It came from inside," one said, holding a lump of charred coal that crumbled in his hand. The Gestapo conducted mass arrests, hunting for saboteurs who no longer existed. They interrogated miners, mechanics, and widows, torturing confessions from innocent men. But there was nothing to confess. The damage was done, and the ghosts had vanished. The war ended not with a single explosion, but with a slow suffocation. The Allied invasion pressed forward. Germany's supply lines collapsed. Locomotives rusted where they stood. Historians would later calculate that the sabotage of rail lines had delayed German reinforcements to Normandy by weeks, perhaps even changing the course of the invasion. But for those who lived it, the numbers meant little. What they remembered was the silence that followed the laughter. The same officers who once mocked Donovan's dreamers now stood in the ruins of their own empire, staring at ashes that had once been trains. After Germany's surrender, the OSS compiled its final report on European operations. It was a thick binder of field dispatches, code transcripts, and mission summaries. Among its pages was a section titled Coal Operations, 1943–44. It listed 437 confirmed railway sabotages linked to explosive coal. Below the statistics, someone had penciled a single line. They laughed at the spies until their trains began to die. The handwriting was Donovan's. But even victory brought questions that no one wanted to answer. How many civilians had been killed by those explosions? How many resistance members had been executed for carrying the devices? In the glow of triumph, the moral shadows grew darker. The OSS men had waged a war that blurred every boundary between soldier and spy, hero and criminal. Was the deception justified? Could a good war still be fought with invisible weapons? Donovan never said. When asked years later about the ethics of sabotage, he simply replied, "War itself is deception. We only played by its oldest rule." Yet for many of the surviving agents, the ghosts of their missions never left. Some returned home to America and found themselves unable to talk about what they had done. The files were sealed, the stories erased. Elise Vanderveld's name appeared once in an OSS memo under the word executed. Marcel's name was never written at all. But their work lived on in every derailed convoy, every German officer who flinched at the sound of a train whistle. History remembered the thunder of armies. It forgot the whisper that made the thunder possible. In 1945, as the OSS disbanded and its remnants evolved into the CIA, Donovan gave one last speech to his departing officers. He stood before them in a dim Washington auditorium, the air thick with cigarette smoke. "You've proven," he said, "that victory doesn't belong to the loudest army, but to the quietest mind. The Germans built machines. You built illusions, and illusions win wars." The men and women in the room didn't applaud. They just nodded, weary, proud, and haunted. The legacy of those operations outlived them. The tactics that began with fake coal would evolve into the foundation of modern covert warfare. Psychological operations, sabotage networks, and misinformation campaigns that could topple regimes without firing a shot. The lessons of Europe's burning trains would be reborn in the Cold War, in jungles and deserts far from the snow of Lyon or the rail yards of Antwerp. The invisible war never really ended. It only changed its shape. Years later, a German engineer who had survived the rail explosions visited a museum in Munich. Behind glass was a small black object labeled Explosive Coal, OSS Type A. He stared at it for a long time. It was so ordinary, so harmless looking, just a lump of rock. A curator told him it was filled with plastic explosive, used by Allied agents to sabotage locomotives. The man smiled faintly. "So that's what it was," he said. "We searched for the enemy everywhere, except in our own hands." That was the irony that defined the whole story. The empire that prided itself on total control had been undone by the simplest deception. It wasn't brute force that cracked the Reich's armor. It was the idea that no system, however perfect, is safe from imagination. Every great power believes itself invincible until it faces an enemy that doesn't play by its rules. And yet, for all its brilliance, the operation carried a quiet tragedy. The people who made it possible received no parades, no monuments, no graves marked with flags. They were shadows in the margins of history. Their courage was the kind that left no witnesses. But in the end, that was their victory. To fight unseen, to win unheard, to prove that power built on fear can be undone by faith and creativity. As the 1940s faded into memory, Donovan himself became a symbol of that paradox. He died in 1959, long after his OSS had turned into the CIA, and long after his ghosts had faded into legend. At his funeral, An aide placed on his coffin a small black stone shaped like coal, a quiet tribute from the men who had once made fire from darkness. The historians who later studied the sabotage campaign described it as a masterpiece of psychological warfare. They were right. The explosions didn't just destroy steel, they destroyed certainty. They reminded the world that intelligence could be more powerful than artillery, that imagination could wound arrogance deeper than any bullet. In the years that followed, one question kept resurfacing among scholars and soldiers alike. Could something like the OSS coal campaign happen again? In an age of satellites, drones, and cyber warfare, is the next invisible weapon already being born? The world laughs at new ideas just as the Germans laughed at those spies in 1943. But laughter, history shows, is often the prelude to fear. When the trains burned, there were no heroes on the scene. Only silence, fire, and the faint echo of disbelief. Yet that silence spoke louder than any victory parade. It said that empires fall not because they are attacked from without, but because they crumble from within. And it whispered the oldest truth of war, that arrogance is always flammable. They laughed at the OSS spies. They mocked their tricks and their childish toys. But when their trains started exploding from within, the laughter turned to terror, and terror to silence. The coal burned, the empire fell, and the ghosts who started it all disappeared into the smoke, leaving behind a single lesson written in ash and irony. In every age, the most dangerous weapon is the one no one believes in. Wars are won not just by soldiers with guns, one declassified OSS memo read, but by ghosts with secrets. And somewhere, if history has a sense of humor, those ghosts are still smiling, because every time the world laughs at an impossible weapon, they know what comes next. Which modern invention, you have to wonder, will make us laugh today, before it makes us afraid tomorrow?